Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today in conversation with two of my personal heroes, extraordinary men who are, in my view, at the front lines of really waging the life and death battle right now to save democracy. And it is a life and death battle. All of you know both of these important authors. The books are Greg Palast's How Trump Stole 2020, The Hunt for America's Vanished Voters, and Daniel G Newman's Unrig, How to Fix Our Broken Democracy. And again, the minute you're done with this interview, you have to literally drop everything and order both of these books, because everyone knows that our democracy is going down in flames. Both of these men have been tracking the ways that it could go down in flames ahead of the curve and fearlessly for months and years in their careers. Now it's all coming about as they foretold. And really, we've got a short amount of time. No other books, both separately, but I think even more importantly together, hold the key to what we can actually do to save the vote, save the election, save democracy. So their bios are as important as these individual titles. Greg Palast, of course, is the freelance journalist who exposed some of the biggest scandals of the last century and now this one. He's a 4 times New York Times best-selling author. He writes regularly for many important outlets, including, well, I read him most recently and he blew my mind in Rolling Stone, but he writes for The Guardian, he's on BBC regularly, and a host of other outlets. And he has his own investigative nonprofit with a really exciting venture that he'll tell you about to get out the vote and make sure we fill out our ballots properly. Daniel G Newman is the president and co-founder of MapLight. And MapLight is a real inspiration to me as co-founder of Daily Clout, because it was kind of a beacon of what you can do in the democracy protecting space. MapLight exists to shine a light on money's corruption in politics. Now they're shining a light on fake news. But before Newman was running MapLight, he was named one of the 100 most creative people in business by Fast Company. He had a for-profit company, Say I Can, which is speech recognition software, and he was a Harvard fellow. So extraordinarily distinguished men, and as you know, I've spoken to each of them separately, but this conversation, I'm not exaggerating, is one of the most important conversations we can have as they communicate with each other about what to do in this emergency. So welcome to both of you.
Welcome, Naomi.
Thank you.
Nice to be with you.
Thank you.
Virtually, safely.
That's right. You're actually hosting, so you are welcoming me, and that's it's delightful to be hosted by you virtually, and it's so wonderful to have you both in the same space. So let me get right to it, because I really see you as the two men who can save it as it goes down in flames. Both of you, I'll let both of you express the theses of your respective books in the answer to this first question. But what I want to ask you first is, where do you agree with each other about the threats to democracy and to the election? And then my next question is, where do you disagree? Where do you think your different focus, your different warnings kind of differ from each other, so that someone can, listening to you both, can get a full sense of the arguments that you're making and where one of you might have seen a danger the other might also now know about by reading each other's books.
If you want me to start ahead. Okay, this is Greg Palast. And well, the reason I say the book is called How Trump Stole 2020, it's not a prediction, it's a warning, and he did steal it already. We can steal it back. We can bust the burglary if we take certain steps. So I've written the book to show you how they've shoplifted the election and how you can basically protect your vote and take it back, both through agitation, legislation, but especially protecting your own vote. You're going to have to take action to do that. So I called my book How Trump Stole 2020 because it's not a prediction. I don't know who's going to get the most votes. It is a warning about the theft of your vote and the blockade to your voting. and your friends' votings. So now to steal, we can though steal it back. That is bust the burglary. And so I'm explaining how they do it, how they block your vote, how they don't count your vote. And I've done it in How Trump Stole 2020 in what I hope is an interesting way. In other words, I don't want you to cry through the book when you read all these things. Both myself and Daniel Newman, in his book, Unrig, we are both trying to make the decay of American democracy, its destruction at the hands of vicious billionaires, as entertaining as possible. So he's written it in graphic novel form. I actually have 48-page comic book in the middle of my book and lots of photos and interesting stuff because I want you to read it. I want you to take it in, maybe have a few laughs and probably a few tears, but I want you to protect your vote. And you get, now the difference between our books is that Daniel Newman is concentrating on the money side. Now I include the money side. Those who know Greg Palast know I was by profession for many years before I was an investigative reporter. I was a financial investigator, a detective, working with the Justice Department, attorneys general around the world. This is what I did. And so yes, it's about the money. It's always about the money. But Daniel takes you on a path and shows you in disgusting, corroded detail, but in an interesting, colorful manner, in a colorful book, how money has poisoned American politics. I learned stuff I didn't know about, like the democracy vouchers of Seattle. I won't take away your topics, but I hope you'll get to that one because that was like fascinating and you want to hear about that. So what a pleasure to come back with you, Naomi, and to be with really one of my heroes is Daniel Newman.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that, and I agree with you, is that both of you could have spoken to the elites, spoken in language that's difficult to understand, spoken in jargon, gotten lots of kudos from a tiny coterie, but both of you, the way I see it and the way I'm hearing what you're saying, made the decision, and Daniel and I talked about this when we last spoke, as did we, to make it as accessible as possible because you don't want just 6 people who are really influential to read this book. You want everyone and their grandma and their dog and their 12-year-old to read this book. Daniel, can you tell me how Unrig and How Trump Stole 2020 are on the same page with the warnings we're facing?
They do, and thanks for those comments, Greg. I think your book does such a great job of making it being engaging, and you have a point of view, and it's not like one of these dry books. It's about voting rights, right? And that's like a really could be complicated and intricate, but you kind of you have an appropriate sense of outrage, and you're painting a picture in a way that people can do something about it. And I share those sentiments about. Here it is, the rules of our democracy, the voting rules, money and politics rules, gerrymandering, all these things that are kind of arcane and technical, they control who has power. They control who writes the laws that all of us live under. And so by writing this graphic novel, a partnership with the illustrator, George O'Connor, it puts in 250 pages of comics. What are the rules of our democracy? How are they stacked in favor of the wealthy? But then really importantly, what you can do about it and what are the solutions? Greg mentioned democracy vouchers. In Seattle, they're a group of 10 citizens, that's all it took, started a movement that now has led to the city mailing out $100 coupons to every person in Seattle that they can spend on city council candidates and mayor candidates. And what that means is if you want to run for office, and you want to represent the people and not the big money special interests, then you have the means to finance your campaign and run and win. And so it was really important to me to show people solutions, to show people the ordinary folks who are actually making this happen. And one of the things, Greg, I really like about your book is you also put it in kind of an action manual kind of form that here are specific things that you can do to protect your vote.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, actually, at the back of my book, we have something which we call the Ballot Condom for safe voting. Greg and Ted's new improved ballot condom. No, you don't wrap it around the ballot. You do follow the 7 steps, starting with check your registration. I don't care if you've been voting at the same place for 30 years. Please go online to vote.org, or even better, to your county board of elections. Every county, every state in America allows you to look up your registration. And you think, oh, I've been voting the same place 30 years. Well, 16.7 million people have been removed, purged, wiped off the voter rolls in the past 2 years of record keeping. That could be you, about 1 in 9 voters. Please. It was me. I looked myself up, Greg Palast, no such voter in California. So I re-registered right there online. Please do this.
So turning to you, Greg, what would you say of all the incredible threats to the integrity of the elections that you identify in How Trump Stole 2020? What would you identify as the biggest threat? You know, why is this time worse, it sounds like, than ever before? And, you know, what would you hold up as the one takeaway of scary thing that people should know about from reading your book or from being about to read your book?
Some people are going to freak out when I say it. The scariest thing is mail-in voting.
No
Mail-in voting is the most dangerous form of voting that we could imagine. 22% of all mail-in ballots are never counted. Now, wait a minute. Is Greg Palast saying, don't mail in your vote? Like Trump? Have I turned orange? No. No. What he's trying to do is make it difficult for you to vote and put your mail-in vote at risk. In other words, right now, 1 in 5 mail-in votes isn't counted, and he wants to make that, you know, 7 out of 10, right? So what do we have to do? You must mail in your ballot. That is, you must get an absentee or mail-in ballot, but you must learn how to protect it.
Are you saying that that's better than going to the polls, Greg?
Oh, absolutely. Look, we know, unless something extraordinary happens that no expert can predict, at this moment, the virus is going to be with us. You can't wait in those lines because whether you're going to, if we're going to have 100 million people go to the polls, 150 million people go to the polls this last time, we are going to have millions sick and many die. And that's insane. You shouldn't have to die to vote, but you have to know how to protect your mail-in ballot. And the number one way people lose their votes mail-in is you don't get the ballot. Now, if you're in Oregon, if you're in California, Washington, in other words, if you're in the what I call Pacifica Nation, Hawaii and Colorado, you're going to get your ballot mailed to you. You're cool, pretty much. The problem is in America, which does not include California, Oregon, or Washington, okay? In America, it's a bitch to get your ballot, okay? Jerry Thomas. Yeah. So you've got to do 2 things. Number one, if you're not registered, if you're on that part of that big 16.7 million purge list, you ain't getting no mail-in ballot. Remember, this might sound simple, Homer, but if you don't get the ballot mailed to you, how do you mail it back in? So in California, it's just going to be sent to you. Oregon will be sent to you. In Georgia, Ohio. In Georgia, they're not even sending out the usual cards that say, do you want a mail-in ballot?
Oh my God.
You actually have to contact your county office and request the mail-in ballot. Now, I got to tell you, not so easy. Jerry Thomas requested his ballot 45 days in advance with his wife in Georgia. It arrived June 10. The election was June 9. Now, are these unsophisticated people? No. Jerry Thomas's wife, somehow she got her ballot in time. She's the head of the ACLU of Georgia.
Oh, no.
Stacey Abrams, the top voting rights figure in this nation, almost lost her mail-in ballot because it came in with an envelope that was already sealed in the Georgia humidity, the envelope inside that you have to return your ballot in. She knew enough as a Yale law graduate not to just put it in another envelope, that she'd lose her vote. 3.3 million votes, mail-in ballots, were not counted in 2016. And unfortunately, it's not just anyone's vote, particularly young voters. When you look at the demographics, and again, it ain't Greg Palast. I wasn't sitting there counting the ballots that were thrown out. It's a study by Caltech. The mail-in ballots, the people that get shafted on mail-in ballots are young people, Hispanic voters, Asian American voters, African American voters. In other words, voters of color, and the color's blue.
Right. So tell us again, for people who missed our first conversation, what you found out about how an algorithm purged a disproportionately number of voters of color, please?
Wow, there's many ways. Number one, I'm the reporter, as you'll see in the book, who uncovered how back in 2000, Bush won because they called 58,000 black men felons. And I'm not guessing because it says BLA next to their names in the voter rolls. 58,000 black men as ex-cons who weren't allowed to vote. Their only crime was voting while black. There wasn't a single illegal voter on that list, just black voters who had names similar to someone who was convicted somewhere of a crime. That worked so well that they took that game on the road and they expanded it to things like in Georgia, where it was first tested out, and in Ohio, they said, if you've moved, and how do they know you've moved? You missed a couple elections. Well, what does that have to do with moving? So we had experts go through their lists and see, well, who moved in Georgia? They said 500,000 voters moved. Where are the U-Haul trucks on the road? So we discovered that, in fact, 340,134 of those voters who lost their registrations, who were wiped off the voter rolls, never moved anywhere. They're still in the house where they registered. But it included people like Christine Ford. Christine Ford had been voting in the same voting station for 50 years. I was there at her voting station. It's going to be her 50th year of voting. They said, you're not registered here anymore. This is Martin Luther King's cousin. So you know that she was guilty of voting while black. This is what's happening around America, but it happened to me. I was purged. It can happen to anyone, but especially if you're a voter of color or you're a young voter, you better check your registration. And if you've moved down the street, baby, you definitely better re-register. Even though the law doesn't require it, you won't get your mail-in ballot. I guarantee it. If you moved and didn't notify the voting authorities. If you've changed your license, listen to me. 60% of Americans think that when you go into the DMV and you change your address for your driver's license, that it changes your voting address as well when you move. No, it doesn't happen that way, okay? The only state I think that does that, in fact, is Oregon. But, you know, in America, that don't happen. You're gonna have to re-register, please.
Re-register, got it. And how about you? Oh, this is so terrifying. How about you, Daniel Newman? What is the scariest thing that you're trying to sound the alarm about out of all the many scary things you identify in Unrig?
Well, I think one is the fact that this is going to be unprecedented amounts of mail voting further because the reasons that Greg said, like standing in line is a health hazard and you can vote from home. Where I should say that states that, you know, the rules here matter, like these little intricacies of, does it have to be the same envelope, and is it postage paid, and how long in advance do you have to get it, and does the state send out, like all of these things, like they seem like little small technical things, but oftentimes these elections turn on very small margins, as we've seen over and over. And so the states that do this the best they just have the voter in mind. They're like, let's make it easy for the voter to follow the rules because the rules are easy to follow. And then you have the states on the other side that try and make them really restrictive. So given that there's going to be this flood of mail-in ballots, many states are just not going to be used to this level of mail-in activity. And so it's very likely that the final winner of the presidential election, as well as other lower down ticket elections, will not be known on election day. And we as a country are kind of conditioned like, oh, well, let's get the election night counted, let's get it out quickly. And the concern is that the president is going to try to delegitimize ballots that were perfectly legitimately cast. And I say this not out of speculation really, but because he has already done that in like the midterm election and saying, oh, like when the Republicans are ahead, he said, well, let's stop the count now, which is completely bogus. And so my message sort of to individuals is let's set expectations as widely as we can that that we are going to do a careful count, and things are not going to be, there's not going to be instant knowledge of who won and what the final vote totals are. And we have to make sure that the officials have the public support to actually do the count that they're away.
So let me just add something. Keep in mind, we have one of the nasty little secrets of American voting, which is what I have in How Trump Stole 2020, is that we don't count a lot of ballots. A lot of ballots are simply never counted. And we had, for example, 935,000, almost just short of 1 million provisional ballots were challenged and not counted. We had 600,000 ballots challenged, most of them mail-in votes, because someone said, oh, that signature doesn't match the registration signature. So that you have to sign your ballot. And if you've signed it in a way that's different from the registration signature, and I was just asked, well, what type of expertise do people have to challenge your signature? The expertise is they're Republicans. That's it. In other words, they just say, I don't like that signature. Now, I saw this happen. I was covering for Democracy Now! The counting of the votes in Michigan. Now, Donald Trump supposedly won Michigan by 10,000 votes, but 75,355 ballots were never counted in Detroit, Michigan. So wait, if you count 75,000 ballots in Detroit, Motown, I think it might overwhelm the 10,000 votes that Trump supposedly won Michigan and the presidency with. So Jill Stein paid for a recount, and what we called the recount, in fact, was counting those ballots that were never counted in the first place, 75,000 ballots, with a marvelous machine called the human eyeball. Because, you know, we can see when the machines broke down in Detroit and couldn't count the ballots, the human eyeball can't. Donald Trump sued to stop that count. But in the meantime, and here's what I'm talking about, get ready for November. GOP lawyers and GOP poll watchers, when they were counting those ballots, challenged virtually every single Hillary vote. They said, whatever it was, challenge, challenge, challenge. The Democratic Party did not challenge a Trump vote. They didn't even challenge the challenge. So we ourselves are going to have to take control. So if you're young and you're healthy, volunteer as a poll watcher, volunteer as a poll worker. We have to make sure that the challenge is challenged, because Trump's got an army. He's going to put together a vigilante force of 50,000. And while many people are concerned that this force is there to intimidate voters, I don't think they're going to intimidate anyone. That is, I don't know any voters I've met that will be intimidated by these schmucks in Hawaiian shirts. But what they can do, the Boogaloo Boys and the Proud Boys and the 3%ers, the Oath Takers, and the and the whole Alex Jones crowd too, they're going to walk in and start challenging every single ballot. 100,000 people lost their vote because of postage due. 8 states require that you have a witness signature. In Alabama, it's 2 witness signatures, or you have to notarize your ballot. So learn all the rules and get ready to challenge the challenge.
This is, I have to share the way it was making me feel when both of you were describing, I think, very plausibly. And if anything, I think you're being like gentle with the audience, because you're right to say, get ready for November. It's going to be a melee, you know, and what you've just described of challengers, challenging challengers, how can that end? I mean, God forbid, it's such a tinderbox to erupt in violence, right? Especially with the kind of policing that we've seen, the kind of militarized policing we've seen in Portland, and, you know, in addition to these militias, basically these.
David, let me ask, David, do you expect violence? I do.
Daniel, yeah, I don't think.
Daniel,
yeah,
mark that, please. Go ahead.
It's really hard to say. You know, I'm not really one for prediction in such an unpredictable time that we're in. I think that there was this great report that just came out called from the Transition Integrity Project, where they did kind of like a simulation of all the complexities of the election and what the different actors might do. They found that actually the winning strategy was to go the other side into being violent. So you had in these scenarios, you had like Trump and his supporters trying to goad the Democrats into having violent street protest, and then Trump looks like the candidate of law and order. So it's, you know, it's really, I think one of the intricacies though is that, like, we don't want to wait until after election has happened, right? I mean, how many people were complacent 4 years ago, right? Hillary Clinton is going to win, and do I really need to push, push, push? But then when Trump ended up winning the presidency, you had $9 million raised for Jill Stein, as you meant to try and, you know, unfortunately not undo it, right? So it's, I think you're exactly right, Greg, like now is the time to focus. And, you know, when we think about like, you know, John Lewis, who recently passed away, right, who said of like the Supreme Court majority, Republican appointed, that rolled back voting rights. He said these men never lost their farms. They were never beaten or jailed. No one they knew were killed simply trying to register to vote. I mean, this is the legacy in America of violence to prevent people from having the vote. And so here we are, fortunately, violence free, right? Like we have the freedom to actually like take the steps you're talking about, Greg, spread the word about how we have to protect the vote and like be patient, you know, in the counting of the election. So there's a lot we can do here.
Absolutely. I just want to chime in and say what I wanted to foreground is this warning I hear from both of you: be patient. That we have to let people know going into this that it's a marathon, not a sprint. You know, as you said, it's not going to be resolved. We're not going to have that ritual of going to sleep the night before and waking up with a new president, probably, right? And the reason my heart is sinking is that I'm having like a traumatic memory of 2000, where I was advising Gore as a consultant for Gore 2000, and the hellish unfolding of actually democracy in action, people counting the vote, and suddenly the right was so able to preempt people's patience with beating the drum, saying, sore loser men, you know, what are you waiting for? Hanging chads. And these, I mean, you say that these guys in Hawaiian shirts aren't going to intimidate anyone. Those guys in button-down Oxford shirts that materialized out of nowhere in Florida in 2000 did take us back. We were much less used to, you know, intimidating groups of men standing around polling places. And
well,
so,
actually, this is very interesting. Let me bring people a little bit into that story. Roger Stone, and I'm very concerned that Roger Stone's been let out of prison, and he's been let out of prison because you're letting a wild animal out of prison.
wow.
He's the guy that organized what was called the Gucci riot. Okay, you had all these consultants, like you said, in button-down Oxford shirts, screaming, hollering, banging windows, creating complete mayhem in the Miami-Dade clerk's office, county clerk, to stop people from counting the ballots. Just like in Michigan, where, well, there they use just legal challenges, because in Florida, just the same thing. They were looking at the ballots. The human eyeball can read votes that machines were kicking out. By the way, 179,000 ballots were rejected in the 2000 race. 179,000 ballots. We talk about hanging chads. What is a hanging chad? It's just a piece of cardboard that's stuck to the back of a punch-out ballot. Someone tried to vote, and they denied them their vote, counting that vote, because there's somewhere on that piece of cardboard, there's a little piece of cardboard hanging on the back. You know who that person voted for. They punched a hole.
Yes.
I will say, you know, in terms of what can be done right now. So like right now today, many states are revising the rules for mail-in ballots because people are stuck at home. Right. So you had North Carolina, which has loosened up somewhat on their very restrictive rules. But will they loosen up more? Like, these are decisions by the state legislature and the governor, and they're happening right now. So one of the things that you can do there, being at home watching this, is get in touch with the voting rights groups in your state and help them lobby for postage page ballots. And so you don't need a witness in this time of COVID, and other things that are like, again, small rule changes, but will make a big difference on the margin and can be done today.
Well, in fact, two things there. Number one, in the states, you do want to push for changes, but be careful. A lot of people in Wisconsin lost their vote because a judge said you didn't have to have a witness signature. You didn't need a witness signature on your mail-in ballot, which is a crazy thing. Only 8 states require that. Why should there be a witness signature anyway? So a court said you don't need a witness signature, and then the day before the election, the Supreme Court of Wisconsin reversed, and all those people mailed in their ballots, thousands without that witness signature, they were all junked. So be very careful, and I know that there are crazy mail-in rules. We should try to change them, but if we can't, you gotta follow them, no matter how insane they are. And by the way, like in Wisconsin, if you have a student ID, make sure there's only very few students have the mail-in ID, the ID you need to vote. And if you're a first-time voter, first-time mail-in voter, you're gonna have to include a photocopy of that ID. And if it's the regular student ID, sorry, you better go get a gun license, because that you can use to vote, but not the normal student ID. And if you use a student ID, are you ready for this in Wisconsin? You have to have a letter saying you are a student enrolled in good standing. So, if you didn't pay your tuition, you flunked algebra, does that mean you can't vote for president? This is the crazy stuff that's going on. And I agree with Daniel. Let's start agitating against it. And there are a lot of groups like ACLU of Georgia, I know, is suing about the postage in Georgia. And having to, because 100,000 people lost their vote for postage due in 16. That's going to be worse now. A lot of it, by the way, because people think I have to put one stamp on, and most ballots are 2 stamps. This is the games that they play, because someone's going to challenge your ballot. Now, counties can also make things easier. Some counties can actually have the authority under state law to do things like, in their county, mail everyone a ballot, or mail everyone, like in Los Angeles, we've got these huge kind of postcards, pull out postcards, which help you vote. Right. Extremely helpful. Right. And that's done at the county level.
Right. So people watching this who are not, I like to call myself a democracy nerd, as Daniel knows. I think all of us can proudly call ourselves democracy nerds, but people who might not be that in the weeds are listening to this, and they're probably feeling quite depressed and disoriented. How do you know? Let me give you an example. My son is a college student, and he's part of an organization to get his peers to vote. And they're texting people and saying, go to Turbo Vote, make sure you're registered. And people are saying, how do I know you're for real? Well, I don't want to give you my information. I don't want to engage with you, because people are so jaded and traumatized that there are all these fake outreaches and, bad actors interfering with communications about voting. If I'm just sitting here watching this, how do I know whom to trust? Are there some organizations? Are your websites, reliable lists of entities that I can go to and be sure I'm not being manipulated?
I can say
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I can say for one thing, the Secretary of State in your state, like you go there and, it's government information. It tells you how to register vote. And as Greg says, there are many rules, like you can get the rules right there. Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, very long time trusted organizations. Greg, I'm sure you have other assets to add.
Yes. At vote.org, you can put it, but again, you have to give it a private nonprofit group, but they're very good. Your email and your address, and then they will check and see your registration status and give you a link where you can re-register online. Every state allows you to register online. By the way, except for South Dakota, because they don't have registration. And by the way, just because they don't have voter registration doesn't mean that they have a bunch of Canadian moose coming in and voting, or South Dakotans sneaking across the border to vote in North Dakota. So, all these things are just crazy impediments. We have to live with them if we can't change them in time.
And what should people what should people do if they do physically go to the polls, they take all the precautions they should, and they're turned away? What's the thing to avoid and the thing to do in that situation?
Number one, avoid, obviously keep space, have your masks, your gloves, but please, if your name is missing from the voter rolls, well, number one, if you're going to vote in person, try to vote in person early. I suggest midweek, because the GOP has now figured out that, for example, in Ohio, 70% of African Americans vote on the Sunday before voting, Souls to the Polls Day, early voting. And I was with Souls to the Polls in Ohio in 12 and 16, and the lines are 5 hours long. So try to go in midweek when those places are empty. If you can and have a mail-in ballot, walk it in. to get it certified and get your signature verified, so you're not one of the 600,000 people who have their ballots thrown for someone challenged your signature.
Great suggestion. How about you, Daniel? Do you have suggestions about what to do if you're turned away, or how to make
I
sure you're...
think there is an election protection hotline. That it's election protection is the website. It's this coalition of national, local, and state groups that they have a hotline to give you advice on this thing. They have volunteers and attorneys do that. I think it's
And
also,
I believe that's a 1-800-OUR-VOTE.
yes. I also wanted to note, just sort of looking at the big picture, obviously voting appropriately enough becomes a big topic around election time. But I want to mention this bill in the current Congress called H.R. 1. H.R. 1 was this bill that the Democrats introduced. This HR called H.R. 1 because it's the first bill that they introduced back in 2019. And if we have a President Biden and we have Democratic control of the House, then there's going to be a lot of competing priorities on what should the Democrats do. And I think it's important that all of us who care about voting and care about democracy make sure that they continue to prioritize actually fixing democracy, right? So that means the equivalent of H.R. 1, it should be the first thing introduced in the new Congress, and it should be the first thing passed, because we've seen this pattern historically. Is the party out of power puts forward reforms, but then when they get in power, they don't actually want to do them.
Right.
And so it's important, like, not just to focus on your individual vote in your individual state now, which is critically important, but to make sure, like, national voting standards, an end to gerrymandering, reinstating the Voting Rights Act, all of which are components of this terrific bill, H.R. 1, continue to get the first priority.
Wonderful. What a great suggestion. You anticipated one of my questions, which is, will a change in party solve this problem? Obviously not. And that's such a great suggestion. We'll follow up with HR 1. We'll do a reading of it and a video and make sure that we'll do all we can to make sure that people keep it top of mind. Let me go back to some possible scenarios, big picture, but you said prepare for the worst or prepare for the long haul. I know no one likes to talk about the worst, but I wrote a book in 2008 called The End of America that predicted 10 steps to fascism, and many of the things that, and I respect that, no one likes to be Cassandra, and I respect one doesn't want to be predicting in an unpredictable environment. But when, I studied closing democracies in different times and places, and they all are identifiable by certain things, and they're happening now. So, you can expect that there will be groups of tough men milling around polls, because that's how decaying democracies have behaved since, the 1920s under Mussolini. I mean, you can expect that there's going to be tampering with the vote. You can expect that there's going to be sowing of confusion around facts in the media, fake news, right? These are all, part of the 10 steps to decaying democracy, even if you don't want to say fascism or tyranny or totalitarianism, if you believe we're not there yet. But I think we have to recognize that it is, we're in a chess match in which the outcome could be, a hollowed out democracy. And where I'm going with that is, say what unfolds. I'm going to just predict it, okay? Because
okay.
I hate doing this, but I'm often right. So I'm going to do it. I'm going to say...
You're famous for being right, so I want to hear what you have to say.
It's not fun, because first people hate you, and then, years later, they say, oh yeah, didn't she predict this? And you want to be wrong about things like this. But what will happen is that there will be so many challenges, as you pointed out, it's not rocket science, to the vote. There will be an effort on the part of the sitting president to muddy the outcome. That's completely predictable. And honestly, if Democrats learn from their example, it's not going to be much better, because there will be charges and counter charges, right? And chaos. I'm going to predict that there will be probably instigators creating violent situations in the streets. I don't want to, but it's foreseeable. What do we do if President Trump says, and I'm only saying this because of the studies of so many other democracies, coming to a shuddering halt right exactly at this point in history. We're not the first people to be here, right? Other democracies have softened, weakened, hollowed out, gotten to this point and come back from the brink, right? But we're not back yet. At this point, what happens is that the sitting president declares a state of emergency and says it's not safe to count the vote. There's too much violence. It's not safe to have civil society. It's not safe to have domestic policing. You start to see what we've seen already, which I think is a trial run, which are, federal troops, or instead of National Guard, possibly even, members of the US military. I don't want to go that far. You don't need to go that far because of fusion centers, right? Our existing, law enforcement at some levels, DHS, are already highly militarized. And the president says, I'm not leaving. Or something like this: we have to take a temporary emergency measure for the next 6 months, where, we'll let you know the outcome at the end of 6 months, but in the meantime, it's too dangerous to have civil society. What do we do? And I said it.
Okay. I've been thinking a lot about that this week. I said, I believe that there will be violence. I'm certain of it. I want people to think about this carefully. And what we saw, for example, the Gucci riot with Roger Stone back in 2000, where it was $1,200 an hour consultants banging on the windows and stopping the vote count. Now we get Boogaloo boys in Hawaiian shirts with crowbars and pipes who are smashing the building, Molotov cocktails thrown into post offices because our president has said there are 1 million ballots in these 12 post offices from Venezuela. Stop the election from being stolen. We have to stop the election from being stolen. There will be protests in the streets on both sides. We already had the test run, as you say. I agree with you. It's a test run of the unmarked SUVs picking up people as if we were in Peronist Argentina. And this is new, dangerous stuff when you have an unmarked secret police. And some people are going to say, I don't know that they are federal troops. All I know is that they're right-wing nutcases grabbing protesters. Someone's going to get killed. You will have. So now Trump is militarizing response to protest. And what I'm worried about is that, for example, the Florida legislature, you have 2 post offices on fire. You have the Miami-Dade county clerk's office is shut down because it's too dangerous to go in because of the Boogaloo boys and the Proud Boys.
God forbid, but exactly.
And then what happens is the Florida rabidly Republican legislature of Florida says it's too much mayhem. We can't count the votes in time. We can't count all these. We have 6 million mail-in ballots, which is what I expect for Florida, 6 million. We can't count them in time, so we're not going to certify the election. The Republicans of Michigan say, we can't certify the election. Detroit is in flames. And Milwaukee's in flames. We can't certify the election. So you have 3 Republican legislatures say it's mayhem in the streets. It's martial law. We've had, curfews. We can't count the ballots. No certification. Now, no candidate gets 270 votes in the Electoral College because they don't send the electors. Real simple. You don't certify the election. You can't send your electors. No one gets 270 votes. It goes under the 12th Amendment. And the 12th Amendment goes to the House. But it's not Nancy Pelosi who makes the decision. Each state gets a single vote. Wyoming gets the same vote as New York. And Donald Trump is reelected constitutionally because our cities are in flames.
So building on that, Greg, that terrifying scenario, it's the newly elected Congress that gets to decide on the new president in that disputed election scenario, the newly elected House. And so, if you care about, the fairness of elections, or you care about Joe Biden getting elected, then it's worth looking at which are the delegations that a few House seats either way would flip the delegation from Republican to Democrat or vice versa. So it's not about the majority of the House, but it's about those delegations. So MapLake came out with this report last week called Election in Peril. It lists all these state delegations. And so that's, there's a lot of effort in how to make sure that a certain party gets the majority in the House. So this is another way of looking at it that's also really important, because in the case of a disputed election, presidential election, a few House seats could actually make that decision. Now, I will also mention this report from the Transition Integrity Project that just came out that gamed out some of these scenarios, like with violence and street protests and such. One of the things they found, again, was the goading the other side into violence was the winning strategy. So if it's Trump supporters that are violent, that could end up sort of boomeranging against him in public opinion. It turns out that the losing strategy is expecting the courts and the legal system to resolve this. And in this simulation, what happened time and time again is like people, Democrats playing Biden campaign officials. Okay, let's sue this, let's go to the court. And the court responses were simply ineffective and too slow. And so I think that speaks to all of us as citizens who want to see a president that actually believes in democracy, is pushing the Democratic Party and the Biden party, the Biden campaign, to be bold, especially in the case of election disputes. Because you can imagine there's a tendency to let's sit back, let's let the court decide it. But it's actually the activism of all of the constituents of the Biden campaign and the Democratic Party and people who want to see that side win that are going to push them to be aggressive. And that is the winning strategy.
Well, so what I'm hearing, and I want to reinforce to everyone listening, is a huge takeaway is psychological from this conversation, that going into this election, we have to stay calm. We have to encourage other people to stay calm. If we protest, we need to do it peacefully. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I hear that.
Yes.
We cannot rise to the bait of any provocation, right? And not only that, if you look at the history of protest, it's peaceful, enduring protest that wins. It's short, sharp clashes that lose. So that's really important, and we have to be patient. So patient, peaceful, organized, diligent, watchful, and not get swept up in the hysteria that is doubtless going to be hyped or real or some combination.
Yes.
Let me ask one final question, if I may. This is really one of the most important conversations I think I've ever had, and I think everyone listening can't pay attention to a more important conversation. A lot of the strategy that you gentlemen have both laid out depends on a functioning post office. Our president has already floated the possibility of postponing elections, and he's also already made it clear that he's at war with the post office and has put his own, or is trying to put his own eyes and hands and deputies all over the management of the post office. I just want to share the Daily Clout observed in 2014 the Scottish referendum, and there were a lot of irregularities in the counting of the vote of the Scottish referendum. One of the things we found there was that no one was actually in charge officially of counting the vote. When there were disputed ballots, people were sent to police precincts, who sent them to local councils, who sent them to the Electoral Commission, which sounds like a government body that's supposed to validate the vote, but they're an agency, of the British government from which Scotland would have been seceding. So they are toothless, and they sent people back to the councils, back to the police, in a complete circle. And 400 marked ballots were messed up in the exact same way, and people had no recourse. So where I'm going with this is that was a tight referendum, and some of what happened was hundreds of ballots went lost from the post office or were dumped out of mail bags and found at the side of the road. And so let me turn that over to you. Given that so much of this depends on a functioning, neutral, impartial, effective post office, what assurances do you have that the post office won't be used to not send people ballots, not deliver them back to the counters? What protections are there?
I think, there are so many things that can go wrong, and, Greg knows them much better than I do. I think keeping the post office funded is basically fundamentally what needs to happen to make sure that the whole mail ballot system works. But I have to keep it, despite these voter suppression tactics going on for years and years, right? Candidates do win elections, in spite of these things. And, I've never seen the US more energized to get involved in voting. So I don't want people to feel that these are sort of, I want people know that you know, actually your vote is meant to make a difference, and you organizing your friends and neighbors to votes is going to make an even bigger difference. And if you can get in touch with the groups that are pressuring your state, that'll make an even bigger difference. And so many of the elections turn on things that are close. So your vote and the work that you do will actually make the difference.
Yes. Well, one thing I should say about Daniel's book, Unrig, is that you have many positive stories about how citizen action totally changed the whole political makeup of cities, like Seattle, again, with your democracy vouchers. That was an amazing story. Berkeley, other places that are showing that citizens can take control. The other thing to remember, when I was writing with Rolling Stone, you know, Barack Obama won, and my co-writer, Bobby Kennedy, called him up. Greg Palast doesn't have Obama's number. He called him up and he said, well, what's the story? Do you understand the votes that we figured that you were robbed of 5.9 million votes? And Obama understood all the details. He could feed back all the details of all the votes that were stolen, but his statement was, we just have to overwhelm it. And because, and this is very important, as I say, in How Trump Stole 2020, it's not a prediction, it's a warning. They can't steal all the votes all the time. You can overwhelm it. You can protect your vote. You can protect your registration. But most important, you can just overwhelm them. And I'm sorry, just assume that you don't win an election with 51%. You win with 56%. They just don't steal. They steal a lot of votes. But if you look, 925,000 provisional ballots were rejected. Ballots rejected in precinct is unreadable, uncountable, 1.9 million. Mail-in ballots lost and rejected, 3.033 million. These are numbers from the Elections Assistance Commission. These are the government's numbers of over 5 million ballots that someone cast or tried to cast and never got counted. Now, what do? We overwhelm that steal. We protect as many votes as we can. We stop the challenge because we're going to have 70 million plus mail-in ballots. We have to make sure that that we challenge the massive challenges that we expect, but we can do it.
And I would add to that, you know, when there's public officials in office in your state that want fair elections, then have them keep making the rules better. And so the next round, we don't have to go through this. And voting is a state issue. Trump and Congress don't really make the rules on voting. It happens at your state. Your state has a lot of power, and you have a lot of power to make it better.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, you both have sent us out with very specific ways to be stronger now, having heard you, than we were before. We heard you, we're empowered, we've got the armor of democracy. And everyone, it's not just what you've heard here, there's so much more in both of these books. And again, don't just read both of these books, buy them in multiples. And again, I almost never say that. You need dozens of these books. You need to give them to your babysitters. You need to give them to your children's teachers. You need to give them, you know, to people you argue with, you know, at the other side of the political spectrum, your relatives. Greg Palast's book is How Trump Stole 2020, The Hunt for America's Vanished Voters. And Daniel G Newman's is Unrig, How to Fix Our Broken Democracy. And beautiful books, both of them. If you have additional questions, the websites that you should go to are, Greg, what's your website?
GregPalast.com. Pretty simple. GregPalast. GregPalast.com.
Fantastic, a wealth of knowledge. And how about you, Daniel G Newman?
It's unrigbook.com, unrigbook.com.
Absolutely. Thank you for being defenders of democracy. And I feel so much better knowing that you're in the front lines and shining a light for everyone else. Thank you both so much.
What a joy to be with you again, Naomi.
Thank you, Naomi.
Likewise.
Glad to meet you, Daniel.
Take care, everybody. Onward. Take care.